In this video on C# Basics, I'd like to talk about some shortcuts to defining your properties. Now, probably the most frowned upon method, but it is a viable option, is to make a variable in your class public. And by doing so, that exposes that variable to any of the callers that might be calling that class. The next shortcut to making a property is to use something called automatically implemented property declarations. This is a shorthand version of the full property declaration, but it doesn't include any sort of private backing variable. Then finally, we'll talk about using the prop code snippet as well as the prop full code snippet, which is something that Visual Studio implements to put in your properties for you with as little amount of typing as necessary. So let's first talk about the public variables in your classes. For right now, we have two private int variables of _value1 and _value2. These variables, since they're marked with the private access modifier, are only available to other pieces of code within this class. However, when we marked value1 and value2, the property definitions, with a public access modifier, this means that whatever the calling class is that's instantiating an instance of this my class will be able to access the value1 and value2 property as we've seen in the past. So a shortcut here would be to actually comment out all of this code here and instead declare a couple of public variables called int value1 and public int value2. Now right now down here in my math, the do math method, it doesn't like the _value2 since it's disappeared. So I'll go ahead and change this to just say value2. And now everything works. We've got a couple of public properties here, value1 and value2, and they're both visible from inside of the class. And if we look back here at the program class and inside the main method, you can see we're assigning 4 and 8 to the value1 and value2, and this works just fine. We don't have any sort of red squiggly lines. So you may be wondering, why don't we just do this for all of our properties? Why do we need to go through this process of declaring some private variables underlying the code and then having our public properties like this? Well, that's a good question. Typically in C# language and other object-oriented programming notations, what you want to do is actually something called encapsulation. And encapsulation is a tenet of good object-oriented programming. We will talk about encapsulation at a later time in this series, but just for right now, understand that you really want to limit the amount of exposure your code has to any of the potential operators of your code. So this programming class, this main method here that calls my object here and works with the my class, you don't want to expose too much of the underlying code of the my class to any of the other pieces of code in the project. One particular thing of note is the access that they have. So for example, the public value1 here has both the get and set accessors, but the value2 has only the set accessor. And this allows you to limit the ability of this my object or this main method here to call the my object and then try to retrieve the data from this value2. And sometimes that's exactly what you want. You want to limit the potential for anybody to use your class incorrectly. One additional thing to take note of here is that with the public variables like this, there's no underlying code behind them that allows you to modify or manipulate the data that they retrieve. So for example, if I just comment out my two public variables here and put this back in, I can actually do a lot more than just returning value1 and setting value1. I can actually change the value itself. So I can say, instead of returning the actual value, I want you to go ahead and add 1 to the value whenever the value1 property is being retrieved. You can go so far as to actually do entire pieces of code. So instead of doing _value1, I could do add 2 integers and actually pass along some values here to the add 2 integers. And then when the value1 property is requested for its value, the get accessor can actually perform this add 2 integers function and then return the value back to whoever is calling for the value of value 1. This is a lot more flexible. This provides you a lot more opportunity to change how the behavior of your properties work rather than just simply having a couple of public variables. Okay, so now let's talk about automatically implemented properties. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out these private int variables. So there's no underlying private variables. We no longer have the underscore value 1 and underscore value 2. A shorthand way of creating your properties is to actually comment out the scope or take out the scope of your get and set accessors by putting a semicolon as a terminator to the get and set accessor statements. And you'll see that the value 1 property does not complain about this. This is perfectly fine. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here to value 2, but we'll see that there is a bit of a problem here. If I hover the mouse over the red line here, you'll see that the IntelliSense tells us auto-implemented properties must have get accessors. So if you're going to use this auto implementation of properties, you must have a get accessor. It's just required. However, you don't need a set accessor. You can go ahead and delete the set accessor if you don't want the person to be able to use to set the value for value 2. In our case, we do want them to be able to set the value to value 2. Now, the reason this works is because in the C# language, the CLR actually, when it identifies that a class is being used that has these get and set auto-implemented set accessors here, it actually creates on the fly some private variables in the background, in memory, okay? So you don't have to declare these variables, it does it for you. Typically, what you're going to see syntactically is if I take care of all of these carriage returns and put it all together on one line, and then I'm going to hit Control K, Control D, and that will auto format my code for me. And this is more of typically what you would see a property looks like, where we have public and then whatever the data type is, then the name of the property, followed by the get and set accessors being terminated with the semicolon. Now let's take a look at the prop code snippet and the prop full code snippet. So I'm going to go ahead and comment these back out. And really, Visual Studio has a very handy way to make property implementation and property definitions happen with fewer keystrokes. I'm going to type prop, and then I'll hit the tab key twice. And you can see that this actually defines an auto-implemented property for me. I'll hit tab to complete that it should be a data type of int. And if I hit tab again, it will move now to highlight the my property, the name of this property. I'm going to go ahead and say value 1. And now with fewer keystrokes, all I have to do is type prop and then tab, change my data type, change my the property name, and we already have an auto-implemented property. Now the prop full code snippet does basically the same thing. So prop full tab, but you'll see that we get the backing variable. So here I'm actually on the data type of int here for my private variable called myvar. I'm going to leave it, I'm going to change this actually to a string just for demonstration purposes. And you'll see that down here, as soon as I tab off of the data type of string, watch what happens to the public property. You'll see that the data type for the public property changes right along with it. Now if I change the name of my underlying variable to underscore value 2, and then if I tab off of that, you'll see once again the changes are made automatically down here in my public property. And finally, here on the actual name of my property, which is currently being highlighted by the code, I can change this to say value 2. And we're done. We've already created our full implementation of a property. Now I'm going to go ahead and change this back from a string to an int. And once again, we can see that change here in the public property. And we're all set. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and then take a look at the program class. And you can see it's not complaining at all about the way that we have these properties implemented.